So my title is Self in the World Map, Evolved in the Primate Brain, which is a human ancestors, as a basis of civilized Homo sapiens, which is us. So this is based on my recent ongoing project. I'm leading this project. Is called Integrative Human Historical Science out of Eurasia, and so on. So this is studying, focusing on how the human mind or ancestral human mind evolved in our ancestors' brain that allowed us to get out of Africa and then out of old continent and spread all over the world now. And how the mind is created in the brain through the interactions with material environmental world through our body. So these kind of interactive phenomena is triggering our evolution for our human mind to evolve in our brain. And this is a kind of the group study, and studying with archaeologists and anthropologists. And I am only neuroscientist here. And scheme of in this project is that I'm providing them with the theoretical pillar or conceptual pillar of the whole project. And they are, from my side of view, they are, meaning archaeologists and anthropologists are collecting evidence for us to prove my hypothesis, which I'm going to introduce from now on. So start with the contents of the talk. I was interested in from the beginning of my career, who are we and what are the humans? And I started studying the brain mechanism of the human evolution. And this graph shows how the ancestral human brain expanded along the course of the history. This is 0 is the present, and it's back to the millions of years ago in horizontal axis. And ordinate is the size of the brain. And this yellow regression line is the size of the brain of the group of Australopithecus, the various kinds of Australopithecus for millions of years. And this blue part represents the size of the brain of the Homo lineages, starting from Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and up to Neanderthalensis. And this green part is Homo sapiens. So there are some of puzzles of the hominin evolution of the past history. That is that during the Australopithecus period, the brain slightly expanded along the time, but not as too much as compared to the current extant ape's brain, which is like 800 milliliters, somewhere around here. It's expanded or enlarged, but not that very much. But once the Homo lineage appeared, started from Homo habilis, the expansion of the brain speeded up very much from this former natural selection mechanisms. There's something happened here. And this is the first puzzle, which I'm going to talk immediately after this. And there are further 2 more puzzles here when Homo sapiens have appeared. So this is the size of the Neanderthal's brain. And after Homo sapiens have appeared like 300,000 years ago, nothing have happened in the Homo sapiens until only up to 50,000 years ago. This cultural or cognitive revolution took place, and Homo sapiens started doing many interesting things. And after 10,000 years ago, we have spread it all over the world. And during this period, human brain rather shrunk than expanded. So the brain size peaked at Neanderthals or Heidelbergs. And there's a puzzle that what happened or did not happen during the early period of Homo sapiens, and what happened suddenly for our mind to emerge. So there are 3 puzzles here, and I would like to start with first puzzle, which happens somewhere around here. I call it first phase transition of the mechanisms of the human evolution. And at this time, what happened in the old human environment or a way of living is that they started using tools. The famous one is Oldvan artifact, invented and created and used by Homo habilis. And then after about a million years later, Ashurian artifacts emerged, and more recently, Mousterian artifact emerged. So during this period, along with the tool becoming more complex and complicated, our brain gradually expanded, but in the rather higher speed than the formerly happening. So I thought that the tool use have triggered something in our brain and did my early experiment that Yuki has just introduced you. I started to train the monkeys to use tools who never use tools in the wild. And he can also combine this TB monitor like this. And if you look from the back, he can reasonably, in a short period, like 2 or 3 weeks of training, he will become able to do that. But he never do that in the wild. So meaning that some kind of the changes was induced by tool use training in the monkey brain who never use tools. And as Yuki had introduced, I think many of you already know that by the tool use training, some neural activity changes in the parietal cortex are induced for the neural representation to incorporate the tool into the body schema, and so as when monkey using the video monitor. And at the early stage of my career, I thought this roughly corresponds to what is represented in the more complex mode of the tools, from Oldvan to Acheulean to Mousterian artifact. I'm not getting the detail, but there are some correlations between the mode of representation in the monkey brain and also the human ancestral human artifacts. And during this period of the training, I found, I said that this took place only during 2 or 3 weeks or 10 days at most. During this training period, in the portion of the brain, which is in parietal cortex, that the mode of the neural activity changed, I found in early time, the sort of the gene is expressed only during the training and only during the period of the training and only at the portion of the brain that brain have showed some change in the neural activity. And after this gene expression, I found that intracortical neural connectivity have changed. When you inject a dye into the part of the parietal cortex, then this area of the brain, which is the temporoparietal junction area, project to this part of the brain, in which the neural activity, the neurons that changed activity did not exist. But after the training, the axons slightly extended, like 10, 20 millimeters to the shallower portion of the brain, and then formed a new synapse to make a new connection of the brain. So this means that the training of using tools metaphorically, pressurize the monkey brain to induce some materialistic changes of the brain. And there are several studies after this that followed. And then after this, I found that more recently, about 10 years ago, by voxel-based morphometry, this part of the brain actually expands by electromagnetic signal by like 20% during 2 weeks of the training. And this exactly corresponded to the area where the human ancestral human brain expanded during the course of the evolution. So I named this phenomena neural niche construction, because the niche came from environmental resources, which I'm going to talk in the next slide. But since by the tool use training, the portion of the neural resources expanded, so I metaphorically named it neural niche construction. And after this neural niche was constructed, or in other words, brain has expanded, this area of the brain started to take care of the new cognitive capacities. Again, I cannot get into detail, but like language or calculation, the music, all takes place in this part of the brain. And I named this the cognitive niche. And it was constructed corresponding to the brain where the neural niche was constructed. And since a new cognitive niche is constructed, we started to embed it in the environment, like the tool is embedded in the environment. And this is original definition of the niche construction, which is the ecological niche construction. And typical example of the niche construction introduced by like a beaver, being the mountain field animals creating the dam in the river in the mountain, and created the new aqueous environment or new water niches, which didn't not exist before, and he monopolized this environment and adapt to it. So this is called original definition of the niche construction. And in this way, humans have started from original habitat and expanded to create a neural niche to spread all over the world, and resulting into modern Anthropocene, that the humans monopolizing or occupying the whole surface of the globe. So with these three mechanisms, I thought that from the natural selection that Australopithecus have very slowly expanded the brain, speeded up to make the intentional niche construction, and then by interaction of the three niches, ecological niche, cognitive niche, and neural niche, it's interacted in a positive feedback manner and started to speed up the expansion of the brain and expansion of the cognitive capacity or human mind, and started the modification of the environment in a very higher speed than ever. And I named this phenomena or mechanism triadic niche construction. And this is, I introduced you at the beginning, that will be the conceptual pillar of our current study. And having explained these mechanisms, you might think that this is explaining only the plasticity by learning within the generation. And for this to become an evolutionary mechanism, this phenomena have to be transmitted over the generations to generation for the next generation. And previous evolution mechanisms cannot explain this. But now there are many, many extragenomic or epigenetic mechanisms proposed to carry such an extragenomic information to the next generation. And here, I briefly summarize the evolution of the evolution theories for past 150 years. And probably many of us in our generation have taught that evolution started by combination of the variations and mutation and natural selections proposed by Darwin, the origin of species in 150 years ago. And in this origin of species theory was composed of three concepts or mechanisms. But after 70 years, Darwinian evolution theory has almost extinct or extinguished by many, many reasons. And after 70 years, Julian Huxley has proposed the modern synthesis, or this is called the neo-Darwinisms, that evolution was a mechanism combined with mutation of the genes and also the environmental changes. And this theory we take for granted as the evolutionary theory, which does not allow extragenomic mechanism for the evolution mechanisms. But after 70 years or 2 generations after this, more recently, we are now having more mechanisms, that extragenomic mechanism that inherit information to the next generation, which includes niche construction, epigenetic inheritance, or Ebo-Devo theory, or many other mechanisms. So the evolutionary theory also evolves every 70 years or 2 generations of the scholars. And now it's about a time to propose the new theories of evolution that it can explain the mysteries of the human evolutionary history. So the hypothesis is this: primate ancestors have triadic niche construction mechanisms, and it grew and grew through positive feedbacks among each other and created the modern human cognitive triadic niches. But the hypothesis is that this is very abstract expression of the theory, but please think that this white bar is the pattern of the environment. I'm sorry. And this square is the pattern of the genetic sequences. In the previous theory is that when the environmental condition changes from this shaded area to this shaded area, the only species that mutated to adapt to the new environment with a medium gene expression pattern matching to the environment. And this mutation and environmental changes happens accidentally. That's the only mechanism that the neo-Darwinism allowed for evolution mechanisms. But by introducing triadic niche construction and other epigenetic factors, you can hypothesize or insert some mechanism in between. Is that when the environment shifted a little bit by some reasons, the gene expression pattern with identical gene sequences can be modified through the learning or social adaptation for the expression to shift to match this environmental changes. If this happens within the range of the plasticities of the expression patterns. And if this environmental pattern become crystallized, then probably this does not have to include the learning, but it was modified by epigenetic modification of the gene expression pattern. And then, since the genetic mutation can happen accidentally or at a random probabilistic manner, then the natural selection can be biased toward this direction to pick up those species that modified or mutated along this direction, was adapted and selected by natural selection. So in this way, if the modification happens gradually, then animal activity can modify the environment and gradually adapt and guide evolutionary direction and pattern to a certain direction and much higher speed than accidental natural environmental changes and mutations. So if you insert this mechanism, that can explain the rapid speed of the human evolution by introduction of the triadic niche construction mechanisms after Homo habilis have started to use tools. So this can be the mechanisms of the first phase transition that happened or triggered by the usage of the tools. But here, this rapid expansion of the brain cannot happen in all the brains. There are some accidental preparation for the primate brain that allows the mechanism of triadic niche construction to be introduced. And then, so what is those characteristics of the primate brain is the next question. And I just briefly explained what it is. So this is evolutionary tree of the mammals for from back to the hundreds of millions of years. And here are primates, and here is rodents, our closest relatives of the mammals. And here are like bats, and these are cats and whales and elephants. And these are the number of the species in each order. And this means that these three orders of the mammals are most successful orders on the Earth. And what does it mean? This means that primates depends on the sensory modalities of the vision mostly, and rodents depends on the modality of the tactile or whiskers or somatic sensations and also the odors, olfactions. And bats relies on the auditions like echolocation and so on. This means that their brain, the brains are multi-purpose information processing machine. So their brains are adapted or designed in order to live in completely different information sources. And if you compare the closest relatives, primates and rodents, which rely on vision and also olfactions, their brains are completely different in design. If you compare the brain of the species in this order, in the small species and large species, like this is the biggest rodent, capybara, and this is small monkeys, a squirrel monkey, which share the same environment living in South America. And capybara brain have the size of like 50 gram, which roughly correspond to the size of the macaque monkeys. And rhesus monkeys are here. Squirrel monkeys are here, and humans are here. And this is galago and marmosets. And smallest rodents are mice, and this largest one is capybara. And these colored areas are primary sensory cortices. And if you look at the different sides of the brain, the big rodent brain, a simple inflation of the small rodent brain. It's just become bigger analogously. And if you compare the primate brain, if the primate brain become bigger, of course, these primary cortices, primary sensory cortices become bigger, but you can find much larger expansion in these white areas, which are the association cortices. So this means that if you compare the number of the neurons in this different size brain, capybara brain is equivalent in size of the rhesus macaque, but the number of the neurons are like 1/5 of this. And when the primate brain becomes bigger, it's increased dramatically the number of the neurons. And elephant brain has like twice as big as human brain, but the number of the neurons are like 1/3 of it. So this means that primate brains are designed in such a way that when its brain expands, the number of the neurons increases dramatically and continuously add the new cortical areas, which carries the new functions. So because human ancestors are primate, the triadic niche construction works to create the new brain area to carry the new functions. And this was the premise of this first phase transition to happen. And the next question is the second phase transition. What happened here? So as I explained to you earlier, that the Homo lineage brain, the size of it was peaked at Neanderthal and also the Heidelbergs around here. And after that, brain never expanded or rather shrunk, but humans have studied the many interesting things afterwards. What is the reason for that? That was the next question. And by the brain, after the brain expanded, the Homo sapiens have get out of Africa very rapidly and occupy the whole, this number makes like tens of thousands of years. And during this very short period of time, we have migrated throughout the globe. And this is very unusual for the animal species to live, because this colored area is a primate habitat, and these are density of the primates living in this area. And primates are tropical animals, and they never get out of the original habitat. But humans have embedded into the different areas. And this means that this is the map of the climates. And primates should not get out of the original habitat. If one animal species get out of the habitat, it becomes a different species. If you compare the bears, these are the distribution of the polar bear and brown bear and black bears. And these are different species. And these lives in the different habitat. So meaning that the animals are adapted to the original habitat. So that is the limitation of their living zones. And if you get out of the different area, this becomes different species. Yet the humans, the Homo sapiens, was get out of Africa and also occupied into the polar region and tropical regions and many other regions. And why is it? That probably something has happened in the primate brain or human brain that allow this unusual or forbidden migration as the animal species. And what is it? The next question. I do not have much time to explain in detail, but this is the result of the triadic niche construction that triggered in the human brain. And this have incubated the many human-specific, so-called human-specific cognitive trait. And one of it is called projection, which I'm going to explain from now on. And this is kind of the outward projection or effect that we create in the brain to project on the outside world and make it realize it. The thing is this. As I explained earlier in my talk, by tool-use training of the monkeys, the brain has expanded. And I think I explained that this corresponds to the area that expanded most during human evolution. And probably many of you are familiar that this part of the parietal cortex and STS, superior temporal sulcus area, is reasonable to assume that it carries the information about the body schema and body image and body control. But I was a bit puzzled by the expansion of the secondary somatosensory area. I could not explain the reason for this until very recently, like last year. And this has been the puzzle for a long time, but recently found that in this secondary somatosensory area, this is which is at the ceiling of the lateral sulcus. In this part of the brain, the function of this part of the brain is integrate the environmental information and locate ourselves in those environments. And I called it the self in the world map. Beyond the body map that we all know that is carried by the primary somatosensory cortex around here. The secondary somatosensory cortex is a somatosensory cortex. It's something related with the body. But in addition to the body or intrinsic body information, that combines with external environmental conditions. And this has been published last year, I think. And another latent capability is that mirror self-recognition. And also in S2, we found that there are neurons that recognize monkeys in the mirror. As you may know, that mirror self-recognition is also peculiar to humans, and other non-human animals rarely expresses mirror self-recognition. But we are not sure that monkeys are consciously recognize themselves explicitly, but the neuron does. So I call it latent capabilities, probably triggered by some other reason, but as an exaptation incubated in this cortical area that allowed for later expression or by combination of the different informations. And the theory is this. We all know that body map is created in the primary somatosensory cortex. And this is sufficient to live in the given environment, to recognize ourselves in the environment. And this is in this body map is mapped information only about the body. But also in the non-human animals can use environmental information. And this is a map of the star. And some of the migrating birds uses this external information to guide or navigate their position in the world and navigate to the world. And this body map is sufficient for such an passive usage of environmental information. But once the environmental information was integrated with self body information and created a self in the world map, what happens to the human brain or our perception is that it is easily flip over and create the world around the self map. This is the other side of the coin of the self in the world map. And what the humans started to do is drawing the picture in the star or sign and create a sign. And this is kind of the story made in the brain and project onto the environment. And we even start creating some stories out of these signs. And this is the function of the projection. And this gives a meaning to the environment that we can never reach before. Or it used to be like a source of the passive usage of the passive information, but it's now we start creating the information in the outside world, in the outside world directions. And this allowed us, we hypothesized that this allowed us to get out of the original environment and spread all over around the world. So this comes from since there are some Germans here, probably you know the von Ucusco about this is the theory about the womb belt. What he proposed is that the information usually flows from environment to the brain. This is the input, and but we perceive the environment in the way how we sense the environment. And depends on the species, there are different ways of recognizing the environment. And he called it a neue Kreis, or new circuit on the backward direction. And this is a hypothetical ideal function of the brain, which is not proven as the materialistic mechanisms. But this has been proposed many years ago. And I call it, this is a first order or passive or implicit world around the body map. This is the ideal function of the brain that all the creatures have implicitly to reasonably live in the world afterwards. By triadic niche construction, brain expands and then rewired in the brain, and they created a kind of body or self in the world map. And that, sorry about this, start creating more explicit function of this neue Kreis, which is correspond to phenomenologische Reduktion, or phenomenological reduction. And Husserl and Merleau-Ponty have proposed this as an intentional arc by a conscious self recognize an environment and project their meaning to the symbolized outside world. And in this way, in our human brain, create a world around the self map too, or active or explicit world around self map. And this matters for human functions to live in the world. And how this self is created in the world and form the systematic world senses is that probably came from, again, I don't have much time to explain fully about this, but probably the phenomena that our body axis have rotated vertically in the world triggered this phenomena. If you think about all the body design of most of the animals living in the world after Cambrian explosion, like after 5 billion years ago, many of the efficient animals in the world have the symmetric body design along the body axis, and moving direction is along the body axis, and the sensory organs are accumulated at the front of the body in this way. So this means that all our spatial information principles formed in the brain or adapted by natural selection in the brain takes as this axis as a primary direction or primary dimension of the space, and all designed in this way. But after the primate starts sitting, before bipedal locomotion by the human stand up, the primates started sitting and started to use tools, which means that their intentional direction became vertical to the body axis. And this pressurized massively our brain mechanism to recognize or control our body in the space. All the axes have been rotated, and that's demanded the brain a lot of function, which induce the brain expansion, probably in relation to the environment in the secondary smart sensory cortex. And this rotation have also made us to recognize our standing point in the ground. We can visualize where we are standing, and this becomes the origin of the whole world. If you think about other animals, they can rarely see their foot standing on the ground. And this creates a new dimension or structuralized dimension and position ourselves in the world. And this can be the origin of our human intelligence to start creating these things. And probably this took a long time after Homo sapiens have appeared to trigger these all phenomena collectively in our brain. So so this is kind of the cartoon story that I just want to introduce you, how powerful and effective and how rapid this function of projection can change our world. And many people of my generation probably saw the cartoon called Jetsons. This is a kind of science fiction in 1960s. And this is the cities. It was designed in this cartoon movie. And in 1960s, in central Tokyo, in Shibuya area, this ground was just flat. And this cannot be imaginable, cannot be real at that time. But after 30 years, one generation after this is in Odaiba region in Tokyo. The older building looks exactly the same as Jetsons. And I thought the dream have realized. Probably the architect of this generation have seen this in the image and created this to project into the cities and made the city like this. And another generation afterwards, now everywhere in the world, like in Shanghai, Doha, and Singapore, look exactly like this. And this is the power of the projection, how we can rapidly design the environment and change the environment and modify it. And even this drone taxi is start operating in Doha recently. And we called it air car in Jetsons, which is totally unimaginable in the real world 60 years ago, but now it's real in all over the world. This is the power of the projection. So this means that in the triadic niche construction period, these latent capabilities have been incubated, and the brain portion subserving these latent capabilities gradually expanded in this way. I call it first phase of triadic niche construction. This is a slow and high cost expansion processes because it needs to expand the brain to devote the materialistic resources in the brain and start expanding. But these expansion can subserve only domain-specific cognitive function. It can function independently depending on what kind of environment we are devoted into. But if it's sufficient to get larger, the human mode of the niche or Homo sapiens mode of the triadic niche construction, holding the same principle but in the different mechanisms. After the brain have expanded sufficiently, probably the part of the brain start communicating with each other and rewiring each other and create a new function without putting more resources for brain expansion. And this is realized only by rewiring of the existing resources. So this is a very rapid process and very low cost process. So it can happen very rapidly. And since all the domains are connected to each other, they can exhibit domain general function, which is peculiar to Homo sapiens. And this transition from the first phase to second phase of the triadic niche construction is probably the mechanism for second, say, phase transition to happen. So having explained these things, all the human evolution or cognitive evolution or evolution of the mind are based on expansion of the respective niches. So this is, so since we are humans, so we cannot escape from this mechanism of the growth. Everything have to grow. It's not only the cognitive function or brain itself, but all our systems like economics, politics, everything have to be assumed based on the growth. And it was okay when the Earth resources was very large compared to the human population, but now we are hitting the limit of the growth and what can happen afterwards. But remember that all the niche construction are based on creating the new niches. And we can create the new virtual niches afterwards, and probably some of you are working on this. Then after the next phase transition would be the unification of the older niches and create the new world or symbolic world to realize this growth. And since this is a very low cost and rapid expansion, this can be the next phase transition for our brain and civilization to happen. And again, after this unification of all these niches, this is the interaction of mind, brain, and body and environment through this mutual interactions with each other, which is a concept of this our project that we are now doing. And this can explain our great journey out of Africa and migration into the different environment and modifying environment and creating our noble societies. And this is ongoing study, and this is just a hypothesis, but I hope we can collect the decent and sufficient evidence through the activities of archaeologists and anthropologists to prove this hypothesis and can solve many of the problems that we're facing right now. I think I will end my talk here. Thank you very much.